How's it going, everybody, and welcome to episode 210 of Master My Garden podcast. Now, this week's episode I'm very excited about. I'm going to Australia for the first time. So we've done lots of, I suppose, guest interviews going across the Atlantic to the US and in other places as well, France and so on. But I've never spoken to anybody from Australia on the podcast. And I'm delighted to be joined this week by Kate Flood, who's the compost coach. And she has a new book out all about composting and home composting, and it's very much aimed at the home gardener. And I suppose we all understand or vaguely understand the great benefits that we get from compost and producing our own. But there's so many ways of doing it, and I know that people get a little bit overwhelmed with the brown matter and the green matter and carbon and nitrogen and all the rest of it. So this is exactly what Kate does, and this is exactly what her new book does, is I suppose explain this in layman's terms. So Kate, you're very, very welcome to Master My Garden podcast.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here. It's great to have a little bit of your time to talk about my favorite topic, which is compost and regenerative gardening. You know, it's something that for me is the mainstay of all good organic gardening, starting from the soil up.
Yeah, for sure. We've spoken about that on the podcast so many times about the soil and how important it is, and that it's the cornerstone of everything else that you'll do within the garden. And I think there is slowly but surely increased awareness around how important that is. And compost plays a huge role in that. But you're very, very specialist in compost. So tell us about how you got into compost or where this broad base of knowledge has come from, originated from.
Well, I refer to myself as a binfluencer because I use social media like Instagram and TikTok to educate people about the importance of composting, and it's been an interesting point to get here. So I am a trained teacher, high school teacher, and I specialize in, I think maybe in Ireland you might call it home ec, like
home
cooking,
ec, yeah,
basically.
exactly,
yeah. And so I was teaching my last job, which I was at for about 10 years, was teaching teenagers how to cook. And a huge part of that for me is teaching them about sustainability and, thinking creatively about the whole parts of the plant when you're, cooking for yourself, not only to save money, but also to reduce your waste. But something that I found so distressing was the fact that at the end of every lesson, any scraps or any food that the kids didn't eat, and it was a big school in a city, Sydney, all of it went into landfill bin, into rubbish. And I would plead with the school, who were, great leadership, to allow me to set up compost systems. And they had to let me set up a veggie garden, but they were really hesitant to go down the route of composting on site because of an issue with rodents. They'd had a mismanaged compost in the past that became a ratville, and they didn't want to do it again. So I, as the food tech teacher, kept on taking lots of these scraps home in my own composting systems, but it was just, it was too much for me to manage. And I often felt like quite despairing about the fact that I was giving these young people skills to cook. But, this compost and really responsibly managing your waste is a life skill that everyone needs to know about. And so then COVID hit, and, COVID was a reckoning for lots of people's careers. I had a new baby at home, plus two other older children, and I was on mat leave, and I just really felt like my hands were tied in terms of the impact that I could have on the planet, because I'm quite a strong activist. And so I turned to social media, which I'd never had Instagram as a teacher, because, it's so much of the issues that I had with students was because of social media, with bullying online. But I actually read, do you know the writer? She's a writer for The Guardian, Alice Fowler.
Yeah.
I read one of her articles talking about her favorite gardening Instagrammers, and I had no idea that people used Instagram for things like gardening. I'd only had an experience with how teenagers used it, and I looked up some of them, and they were, fantastic, making short form videos and, using it in a really educational way. So I dipped my toes in, and, my role as a binfluencer has emerged from that, and that's how I got my book deal as well. So it's all kind of quite surprising. And actually some of those students who have now graduated, when they see some of the antics that I get up online, they're like, "We're not surprised, Miss Flood. You know, you always are crazy food tech teacher." So, you know, I've kept really to my authentic self and just sort of have fun with it. But I can see that it's a really important platform for education and for getting people excited about composting in their own backyards.
Yeah, for sure. And like, obviously you're in Australia, and there's, you know, there's people I'm sure following you from all over the world, and composting, and I suppose the act of composting, the process is the same all over the world. There is variances in that. Here in Ireland, we probably have way too much green and maybe not as much brown as you guys might have in Australia because of our damp climate.
Yes.
But typically you're looking at the same process no matter where you do it around the world. And I suppose what you've touched on there in relation to the school and the home ec class, and I suppose the canteens, school canteens, college canteens, and the food waste that's coming out of there, it really is, it's something that everybody needs to be looking at and needs to be campaigning for, because that the amount of waste going out of, you know, schools, colleges, hospitals, and in most cases nothing being done with it except going to landfill, like that really needs to change. And as I said, that's a huge part of what you're doing. So that's how you got into it. There's probably millions of questions on composting. Let's go back to the very basics of
Yes.
composting first, and we'll talk about the various ways, the compost bins, the tumblers, the hot composting, the wormeries, and all the rest. We'll talk about that in a minute, but let's just go to the very basic element first, where we're looking for the mixture of what's going in and what you can compost.
So you were talking about the fact that compost is universal, and it's true, and that makes my teaching about it quite simple, because instead of teaching food tech, now I'm teaching a compost recipe, and it's an easy recipe because there's only 4 ingredients. So irrespective of where you're making compost, you need to add these 4 ingredients to create a balanced heap that has the right bacteria and the right microbes in it, because like so much of the transformation that happens in life, so, you know, yeast in sour in bread, or lactobacillus when you're making sauerkraut, you're needing to encourage the right microbes into the mixing compost. And that sounds a bit technical, but all you need to add are these 4 things. So you need to, first of all, think about your greens. So in compost language, we call it that nitrogen-rich materials. So that's our food waste, grass clippings, green hedge trimmings, seaweed. They're not always coloured green though, so that's where it gets a little bit tricky. So I like to talk about them as nitrogen ingredients, because they can also be things like manure and coffee grounds, which are coloured brown, but they're full of nitrogen. So the microbes in compost need that source of nitrogen to reproduce. And then they need to have a balance of brown materials. So they're things that are rich in carbon. So they're usually the dead, dry, brown matter. So things like fallen autumn leaves when they've dried off and become brown, aged wood chips, shredded paper. It could be even spent plants that you leave to fully dry out and become brittle. So the nitrogen isn't stable. So if you leave a plant out in the sun, the nitrogen will leach away and off gas, and then you'll be left with a carbon-rich shell. So this dry brown matter needs to be balanced with that wet, green, juicy stuff. And that provides the right balance of ingredients for compost microbes to get into the mix. But they also need 2 more things. So like all life on Earth, they need access to water. So food waste is about 90% water. So if you add a lot of food waste in winter, you probably don't need to add more water. But in the height of summer, maybe not in Ireland, but definitely in Australia, we need to add water to our compost piles, because if it dries off, then the biology in the mix will die. And finally, we're wanting to encourage aerobic microbes, and that basically is a fancy word for oxygen. So we're wanting to have microbes in there that have to have oxygen to survive, like us as well. And we can incorporate air into our piles in a number of different ways. The easiest way is turning your compost, so forking it over, using corkscrew compost aerator to mix the ingredients and to add in those pockets of air. If that's a bit labor intensive or heavy, what you can also do is adding chunky wood chips. They create an open pore space in the compost so that your green material doesn't slump and compact down and press out the air. So adding chunky carbon like wood chips or sticks helps create those airy pockets, and that means the right bacteria is going to be in the mix, so your compost won't stink, and also you'll have a much better quality compost in terms of the available nitrogen in it in the end, and also all of those micronutrients as well.
Brilliant. So that's a super easy recipe. So you're looking at green and brown material, or nitrogen and brown material as you call them, and you're looking for sort of 50-50 mix of that, and then you're just ensuring that your pile has constant moisture, and you're adding air by turning or by using the corkscrew mixers to get air down through the compost.
Yeah, that's right. Look, in terms of the ratio, going with a 50-50 carbon to nitrogen is generally a good rule of thumb, but it kind of depends on what you're adding. So I'm a real proponent for Bokashi compost, which is a totally different style of composting. It originated in Japan in the 80s, and you ferment your food waste. You don't add any carbon-rich materials into it. But the reason why I really like it is I ferment batches of my food waste so that they're kind of shelf-stable and they're really active and full of lots of anaerobic. So this is oxygen-free microbes in this mix because you're pushing out the air. But the reason why I like it, it allows me to make hot compost in smaller batches. So I make couple of buckets of Bokashi, which I ferment. You close the lid after your bucket's full for a couple of weeks. And then when it's time for me to make hot compost, I'm going to add that into the mix. And this is like a huge supercharge of available nitrogen because those microbes, they come in a specially selected bran mixture, which people refer to as EM. It stands for effective microorganisms, actually consume some of the food waste and make the nitrogen available to the microbes in my hot compost, which are aerobic, oxygen rich. When I'm adding something like Bokashi or something also high in nitrogen like manure or coffee grounds, then I'm actually wanting to add a bit more carbon. There's the compost language as well. We call it the CN ratio. So that's everything has a CN ratio. So that's a percentage of carbon available to nitrogen in particular plant matter and animal matter as well. So I describe this compost language in my book simply because this is where I feel like people get really muddled up because you kind of feel like, do I need to get a calculator out and start like weighing stuff and doing maths? And actually there is a formula that you can use to work this out. But, I'm not expecting anyone to go out and do that. So I have some tables and some really simple analogies so you can get that mix correct. But in the most simple form, John, if you're just thinking about equal volumes of green to brown, that's a really great place to start because so often when people make compost, they just add their greens, food waste, grass clippings, their animal manure, and all of that has too much nitrogen and you'll end up with a stinky, slimy pile of compost. So if you add in 50-50 browns and greens, you're going to be on to a really winning ticket.
So when it comes to Bokashi bins, so we might just talk about the various types of composting as well. So we've talked about kind of the ratio, and you've briefly mentioned Bokashi bins, and they've become hugely popular here in Ireland. But what you're saying is that you're using your Bokashi as a first stage of your hot composting. So maybe before we get into that, maybe explain Bokashi bins, explain hot compost bins, explain your standard compost bin or your tumbler. And that might give people, I suppose, what they might feel is the ideal composter for their setup.
Yeah, and look, that's something that I really spent a lot of time in my book discussing because I wanted it to be a guidebook that people could pick up and go, oh, I can compost in an apartment because I can use a Bokashi bin or an indoor worm farm, or I've got this big farm or rural property. Yeah, I'm going to make some hot compost on it. So there's lots of different ways to skin a cat. when it comes to compost, there's lots of different ways to make it. And I go through all of those different pieces of kit, I call it, and more in my book. Because I think that diversity is really exciting as a gardener, because there's each different way of making compost provides different benefits to your garden. So for most people with a standard size backyard who are wanting to dabble into actually really using all of their food waste and the organic matter that they produce in their house and returning those nutrients to the soil so you can have a fantastic healthy soil food web and grow nutrient rich plants, the best thing to start with is enclosed compost bin, something like a Dalek style bin. So Dalek, Doctor Who, you know, they're the black tubs that sit on the surface of the soil. The reason why I like those is we're wanting to work with the biology in the soil and get that up into the mix of our compost. And by sitting the organic matter on the soil, it's a win-win. You know, that's direct access into your food waste and carbon-rich materials. So when you're doing slow, cool composting, I call it, you're going to be adding to it ad hoc, slowly. It might take you several months to fill up your compost bin. That's totally fine. As long as each time you add organic matter, you're adding those browns and greens together. And the great thing about slow compost is when compost is made with cool temperatures, the finished result will be much higher in fungi, which all of our soil needs fungi, because our plants have a relationship with fungi in the soil to access nutrients. And also, if it's cool, there's less off-gassing of nitrogen. So it's going to be like a big hit for your plants as well. And with that slow, cool composting, it may take several months to make. You fill up a bin, you stir it every now and again to introduce oxygen. And after 6 to 12 months, you should have some great finished compost to add onto your garden bed. The opposite of that is hot compost. So it's a very different method to make it. You can't add to it slowly. You have to be, I describe it in my book, being a compost cook, because you need to actually, your mise en place is getting all of this organic matter ready in one go. You need to have, in traditional hot compost piles, 1,000 litres of organic matter. So that's about a cubic metre. And you need to gather it all up. So maybe you're going to the beach and collecting seaweed. Maybe you're going to your local cafes and asking for coffee grounds. Maybe you're asking your neighbour for some of their cow poo. You've raked up lots of autumn leaves. You've got a bale of straw to add to the mix. So you've got all of that at once, and you're going to build it in one day. And you're going to add quite a lot of water to the layers as you're building those green and brown layers. And then within usually about 36 hours, you're going to come back and either, if you're a compost nerd like me, put your compost thermometer into it, which is a long probe, or you can stick your hand in and you should feel some really serious heat. So what you're wanting to do is encourage the activity of thermophilic microbes. And they're the bacteria that consume the organic matter and as a byproduct create heat. They'll create temperatures ideally in a hot compost pile between 55 to 60 degrees Celsius. And the reason why they're so useful, this bacteria, is at that temperature, you can add disease plants, you can add meat, you can add, where I live in the country, I often pick up roadkill and I add that into my hot compost as well. It's full of nitrogen, but all of the pathogens are going to be killed off because of those hot temperatures. You're going to create compost much faster as well. But as I said, the heat does actually disperse some of that nitrogen. And you always need to cure it. So curing your compost or maturing your compost, as Charles Dowding likes to say, Charles features in my book, and I use the term curing, he uses the term maturing, is a really important step for hot compost, because you can't think about speed the whole time. If you're just thinking about speed, then you're going to be missing out on a really essential step, which is once all the organic matter is finished breaking down and your hot compost is cooled, you need to leave it to cure for about 12 weeks. And at those cool, low temperatures, worms will re-enter the mix, because worms are not going to be in a hot compost pile that's 55 to 60 degrees Celsius. They'll perish. So worms will come back in and all those other compost critters, and you'll end up with compost that's much better for your garden. Final method. Did you want me to flesh out Bokashi a little bit? Because it is a really interesting method.
For sure.
So Bokashi is a great option for people that don't have a backyard. As I said, it originated in Japan in the 80s. It's a small scale composting system that you make in a fully enclosed bin. So unlike those two methods, slow and hot compost, Bokashi uses different bacteria, which you have to get in a starter. So it's a wheat bran material that's inoculated with the right bacteria. They're anaerobic, which means oxygen-free bacteria. The main one is bacteria that produces lactic acids. So you're in effect, you're fermenting your food waste. So you add your bucket of food waste, a little sprinkle of the EM bran material, and keep on layering it like that, squishing it down to squish all of the air out. And once your Bokashi bin's filled all the way to the top, you leave the lid closed for a minimum of 2 weeks, and your food waste after that period would have fully fermented. And I love to use that in a hot compost, but if you don't have the space, then adding it into a soil factory is a really useful way to process it if you don't have a garden, which is basically a large plastic tub. You add some healthy garden soil from a mate's backyard into it, and then you pour your Bokashi in, and then you cover it with a bit more soil, and that will be beautiful compost. In summer, it's pretty quick to make compost in a soil factory like that. In winter, it's a bit slower. Traditionally in Japan, they would process their fermented food waste by digging a hole and burying it directly into the soil. And it's a really great system because you don't need to be thinking about the balance of carbon and nitrogen. It's just nitrogen that you're adding in there. Yeah. So it's kind of, as much as maybe it sounds technical to some of the listeners, it's actually quite a simple process. And I explain all of the steps really clearly in my book.
Yeah, for sure. It's really interesting. There's a few interesting things coming up there. So I've seen, you mentioned earlier on some of the Instagram influencers, and I've seen a few of them talking about hot composting, and they showed a picture of what's going into the composter, and then X amount of weeks later, this is lovely compost fit for your soil. And I often wondered, was that the process is quick to create what looks like a compost? But I never did fully think that was at the right stage for adding to the garden. So you're saying curing, Charles Dowden says maturing. So what is that time frame? About 12 weeks, you're saying?
So it depends on what you've been adding in there. If you've been adding in meat or manure, then you need to cure your compost for at least 12 weeks. And so to make it really clear, your compost with hot compost may look like brown, humusy soil within 6 weeks, let's say.
Yeah.
But if you use it on your garden that quickly, it actually can contain phototoxic chemicals, which are bad for your plants. So you need to, even once it looks like compost, once it's fully cooled down, you need to leave it, preferably with on the soil. So access your hot compost pile is directly on the soil, so that all of the life in the soil, worms and beetles and critters, can get access to it. And also fungi. So fungi is something that people don't think about that much with compost, because people just assume heaps of mushrooms are going to be popping up, but actually a lot of the processes with fungi happen at a microscopic level, with what we can't see what's going on. Occasionally you might see mushrooms popping up, and that's a great sign, but a lot of it happens without us actually seeing it. But that creates compost that's stable, and compost that has all of the nutrients in it that are plant available. If you use it too soon, it's actually going to do a disservice to your soil. So the great thing about curing is it's a hands-off process. The only thing that you as a gardener have to do is keep that pile moist. If your pile dries out during the curing process, the curing clock stops. So you need to keep it moist, and you need to have access to the soil. But that's it. It just needs to sit there and do its thing.
Yeah, and so that's hot composting. It's an interesting one, because, as I say, lots of people say that you can make compost in a few weeks, and so now what we're really saying is that hot composting, very good way of quickly processing, things like bones, meat, things that might have pathogens in them, but you're still, the overall process, you're still looking at a minimum of kind of 20 weeks when you take both stages, and possibly even longer.
Well, look, you can make, depending on how quick, the bigger your pile, the more heat you're going to generate, the more often you turn it, the quicker it's going to process. But at a minimum, I'd say you can make hot compost in the height of summer when you've got all the ingredients ready in about 3 months. So that's including, the three months of the curing, depending on what you've added in. But you need to, it's really essential to be not forgetting about that step. You know, people just focus on quick things, and you know, we're not getting compost out of a bag. We're actually allowing all of the bacteria and the microbes to do this important work for us. So leaving your compost to cure for those 3 months is really important. You may have had something that looks like soil done within, you know, some of my big piles have kind of look like compost within about a month, but I know that I need to leave it longer. And when you've left it longer as well, what happens is I add a lot of wood chips into my hot compost pile, because that means I don't have to turn it as much. Hot compost is a hands-on process though. So unlike your ad hoc cool compost, you do need to turn it quite regularly. So you need to roll up your sleeves and get ready to do some work. But I've found that with my hot compost, after about a month, it may kind of look like soil, but there's going to be lots of wood in it. I always use aged wood chips, but during that curing process of 3 months, that's a really important time, because all of the fungi that's in there actually helps break down the lignin in wood and the cellulose. And as wood breaks down, it returns any of the nitrogen that it stole from the pile. So that's why you end up having compost that's much better for your soil for lots of different reasons.
Brilliant. To go back to Bokashi then for a second. So as I say, Bokashis are becoming quite popular here. And there's a very good guy, Ollie Green at Better Plants, who's promoting them quite heavily here at the moment. Questions on that. So the liquid that comes out, I've seen people using that as a fertilizer for the soil quite quickly. How is that? Is that a good quality, you know, ingredient to be adding to your soil, or is it too early? Or what's you're thinking on the liquid part of it?
So what you're producing within a Bokashi bucket is the fermented food waste plus, in colloquial terms, we call it Bokashi juice. Don't sit down with your morning coffee and have a glass of it. You'll be sorely disappointed and sick. But basically what happens is, as the anaerobic microbes start breaking down the food waste during that fermentation process, there's going to be some of that Bokashi juice that actually comes into the bottom of your Bokashi bucket. And it's important to regularly empty it, because that is often the smelliest part of your mix. If you drain your Bokashi bucket regularly, then your fermented food waste does have quite a strong odor, but it kind of smells like pickles. Whereas the Bokashi juice can be the stinky part of it if you let it pool there. But Bokashi juice is useful, but it's not the best part of it. So there will be available nitrogen in it, and there will be some of the bacteria alive in it if you use it quickly. It's not shelf stable though, John. So if you drain it out and leave it out for a couple of days, all of that biology in there would have died. So you need to drain it and use it within 24 hours, and you need to dilute it really significantly. I forget the exact dilution rates, but I've got them all in my book. But it's about a tablespoon to 9 liters of water. So it's really, you know, you really have to water it down. I have found though, in terms of my own application of it on my plants, I can see that it is helping give available nitrogen and that bacteria to the soil, and I can see an increase in plant growth. But if you let it sit there too long, it's going to be stinky and not great to use. Another good thing to do with it is, if you have drains that are a little bit smelly or a little bit blocked with hair or grease, you can actually pour your Bokashi juice straight down those drains, and that EM, the effective microbes, will eat through the buildup of hair and fat and oils in your drain. And so you don't have to use something really harsh like Drano. And it's septic safe as well. If you want to give that a go, do it last thing at night, so that you actually have a couple of hours of the EM working before you flush lots of water through it. But I've found with some of our drains that, you know, I've got 3 kids. If there's lots of hair in there, I do find that that's a really effective thing to do as well. So, you know, there's definitely no point wasting it, but it's not the best thing. Equally with worm farms, people are so into worm wee. And worm wee really is quite an unstable product, because worms don't wee. Worms only poo. So the best thing about worm farms is the worm castings. That's a fancy word for their poo. The worm wee is just that lactate, that drains through the castings, and it's not processed in the gut of the worm, so it can be quite variable quality. So yeah, with these liquid forms of fertilizer, like I'm saying that in inverted commas, because really they're soil conditioners. They're not acting as fertilizers in a traditional sense. But there are some really exciting things that you can do making compost teas. And for beginner gardeners, even just getting a handful of your cured compost and putting that in a bucket of dechlorinated water. If you don't have tank water or river water, then you can get some town water and leave it in a bucket to off-gas the chlorine for about 24 hours, and then add a handful of your compost to that. And that just allows you to stretch the love further. So you can sprinkle that over your veggie patch, and a handful goes a much longer way when you've watered it down. Or in my book, I talk about aerated teas as well. There's lots of nerdy things that you can get into. So it's really just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, compost teas, that was something I was going to talk about, but they are hugely beneficial because you're using, and I know Dr. Lane Ingham talks about them a lot, and how it can be used on a large scale. So you're taking that biology that's created in a quality compost, mixing it with water, and then you're able to spread that biology across your whole garden basically, and you're getting the benefit from that small amount.
So she always talks about aerated compost teas. So my example of just basically making a soil drench by adding your handful of compost into dechlorinated water it's not a traditional compost tea.
Yeah.
To make an aerated compost tea, you need to have a proper bubbler. So people often use bubblers that you can get with fish tanks.
Yeah.
And you need to actually pump oxygen jets into the water so that you're keeping the right biology in there. So we've been talking about anaerobic microbes. That's the oxygen-free guys. In Bokashi, they're good, but in the compost pile, they're bad. And in your compost tea, you don't want them to proliferate. You want the good aerobic microbes to proliferate. And so what you're doing is you're creating this right environment for the right bacteria to breed up so that you can spread the love a lot further in your garden, which means for people that feel like they can't make enough compost, and I know that it's definitely the case for us here. We were living in Sydney in a 200 square metre backyard. Well, actually, that was our house and garden was on 200 square meters. And now we've moved rurally and we live on 1 hectare, so 10,000 square meters. And, I'm a self-appointed compost queen, but I'm sort of going, I don't have enough compost. But making compost teas helps with that because you can spread that biology so much further from very little starter.
Yeah. Final question on Bokashi. After you've taken off the liquids on a regular basis, and after a few weeks you're left with the material inside in the drum, and in traditional you're adding that to your hot compost bin, but in traditional Bokashi, that's being buried in the ground, and
correct,
and the process finishes under the ground.
Correct.
I wondered about that. So is that still potentially can that be a rodent attractant at that stage, being buried in the ground?
Look, I have found that we've got some very clever rats in the Beacon Valley. I know I've got a few because we've got lots of chickens. But I found that they're really disinterested in fermented food waste.
Okay.
Other wildlife might be interested, but I find rats and mice, once your food waste is fermented, they actually dislike it.
Yeah.
It's so with Bokashi, because you are fermenting it, it becomes acidic. But the great thing about it is, because if you're thinking, I've got acidic soil, no, that's not the right type of compost for me. Once you add it to your soil, the pH of that fermented food waste increases, and it's been shown, to actually come back up to neutral once it's fully broken down. But I think it's the acidity of it that rodents don't like. Yeah. In my hot compost pile as well, if I've added a lot of meat into a Bokashi, I try and bury it in the middle, but rodents are not going to come anywhere near a pile that's 55 to 60 degrees Celsius anyway. So I've found it's really effective for keeping rodents out of your food waste. If you are concerned about other wildlife digging it up, what I suggest is, if you're wanting to do the traditional way of processing a Bokashi, dig a hole in the ground, bury your Bokashi bucket, and put a piece of wire with a couple of bricks or rocks on top of the hole, And then because it is fermented, it breaks down really quickly as well. So within a few weeks, it will be broken down and it won't be attractive to any animals at all.
Brilliant. Just it's not really part of composting, but I know you talk about it, and I'm sure you talk about it in your book, is biochar. Are you using that in your garden? Are you creating your own? What do you see as the benefits of it? Again, we spoke about it on the podcast. I personally use a very good quality Irish produced one in my garden, and definitely see benefits. So
yes,
maybe give us a little bit of an overview.
Yeah, absolutely. It's in my final chapter, which my editor we were editing chapter by chapter, and it got to chapter 8, which is called the soil. And I talk about all of these different amendments that you can add to your soil, and biochar is probably the one that I'm most excited about. And so this final chapter, I think she was expecting it to be as long as all the other ones, and it's sort of a big juicy chapter with lots of information and lots of tutorials, and I explain how to make things like biochar, because it's such an important string to our bow in terms of our battle to save our planet because of the increasing temperature. And what it does, it actually sequesters carbon back into our soil. So that makes our soil a lot better for our plant growth, but also in terms of returning carbon into our soil, it's better for climate change. I make my own. So I make it in 2 ways. In winter, when I've got my wood fire stove going, which I must admit, we live in a pretty cold part of New South Wales, but I don't like to burn it that much. But I feel like if I'm making biochar at the same time, then that's helping balance the emissions of burning timber. So I've got a small biochar kiln that I put into my wood fire stove, and that's a purpose-built kiln. And basically, to make I'll quickly explain what biochar is. So biochar is a very stable form of carbon. With compost, there's a percentage of carbon in it, but the life in your soil consumes compost. Compost is soil food, so you need to add it every season. But biochar is much more stable. It stays in your soil they've been shown potentially for thousands of years. So some of the best soil in the world is in the Amazon basin, and it's called terra preta. And we now know that the Amazonians amended their soil with biochar, and we can still see to this day from thousands of years ago that it's some of the best soil in the world. And the reason why biochar is so exciting is, so we're thinking about this hard form of it's kind of looks a bit like charcoal, but it has different qualities. But it's basically like this empty apartment block, and we charge biochar with nitrogen, and that allows the right bacteria to enter the biochar as well. And then when you add that to your soil, instead of something that you have to add every single season, the nitrogen and the right bacteria are there to feed your plants for many, many years. So I make it in a small kiln, but I also make it in the ground. So you can buy quite big biochar kilns, but they're really expensive. You can just dig a hole and make it at least 1 meter wide, and make it into a conical shape, so it goes down like a cone. Because what you're wanting to do is burn organic matter, things like timber. I make biochar out of bones and shells as well, at a very high temperature, with a small amount of oxygen. Because if you burn things hot with a lot of oxygen, you're going to end up with ash. You're wanting to have, so the way you make it, it's in my last chapter, because it's kind of for the expert composter. It's not a beginner thing to make. But it's basically you're layering your fire with plant prunings and timber and other organic matter, and you're limiting the amount of oxygen in the mix. And then you'll end up with all this beautiful looking charcoal. It's different to charcoal though, because charcoal's quite alkaline, whereas biochar is still relatively alkaline, but it's closer to neutral than charcoal is. And it has different qualities because it has these things called macropores, which are those big holes within it that can be filled up with nitrogen and the right bacteria. It's a really exciting thing to make. And for me as well, we do eat meat, and I love making biochar out of my bones. I feel like a witch while I'm making it, especially once you've got all of these charred bones, because they still look like bones after the process. They're not burnt away to nothing, but then you have to use a mortar and pestle and break them all down, and then charge them up with nitrogen, and then you can use them in your garden. So it is a magical process.
Yeah, brilliant. We're starting to round off, but just out of curiosity, human waste is, I don't know there's a feature in your book, but it certainly features or has featured on your Instagram page. And it's one that always, I suppose, creates curiosity. And
Yes.
It's one that's obviously people are a bit afraid of, but there's huge, how would you say it? For gardening in general, there's huge untapped potential in it.
Absolutely. Well, we're mammals that poo very nutrient rich feces, and also our urine is full of nitrogen. And I feel like if composting poo is a bit taboo, but if you want to dabble in it, then doing a wee on your compost pile is just adding some free nitrogen into the mix. And there's myths about women's urine not working. That's a total myth. If you're a man or woman, that your urine works just as well. Medication, though, is something. So if you're on medication, antibiotics or different medication, that will come through in your urine. So only use it if you're healthy and not on particular medications. But it's something that we all produce. And the amazing thing about urine, if we're just wanting to go down that way, it actually has enough NPK, so that's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So they're the three components that are in all fertilizers, even petroleum-based fertilizers, which if you go to your local hardware store and get a tub of fertilizer, it's going to be 9 times out of 10 made out of petroleum, and as one component part. And our urine actually has enough NPK to sustain a home garden. So the fact that we're flushing wees away is so wasteful when we could be processing it in our own backyard, adding it with, so we're thinking about, it's maybe depending on how much water you've been drinking, it might be colored yellow, but it's still counted as a green in our compost mix. So we need to balance it with carbon, but it's a really good compost activator because there's lots of available nitrogen in it.
Yeah, for sure. And that is in the book?
It is in the book. Yeah, I talk about composting wees and poos. And I also, so one thing in my book, which I was really excited about, there's 4 feature articles. So one of them is with Charles Dowding, and he talks about how at Homeacres he composts. I'm pretty sure he talks about just wee. He doesn't go down the poo route, but I know that they do. If you are wanting to compost your own feces, you need to make sure you're doing it correctly because there can be pathogens in there, and only using that compost on once it's fully broken down, it can be used on fruit trees, but not on things like leafy greens or tomatoes. You need to be just using it on things with established root beds. But so yeah, there's these 4 feature articles. Charles is in it. Alessandro Spicy Moustache, he is in it. So talking about how to compost in an urban setting. So he lives in, he's moved recently, but he is an Italian guy who lives in London, and he's got a really small but really pumping backyard, and so he does lots of interesting regenerative gardening practices in a small setting. And then Costa, for any Australians listening, who's an Australian gardening guru, who's great, talks about how to be a community composter. And Hannah Maloney is a really interesting permaculture gardener here in Australia, and she talks about how compost fits in her permaculture garden. So yeah, there's lots of different ways that lots of other people compost. So it's a guidebook that you can pick up. I'm amazed when I've met people now that have said they've read it cover to cover. I never really envisioned people reading it like that. I felt like people would pick it up and go, I want to learn about worms now, or I want to learn about human manure. But yeah, people are reading it cover to cover, and it's been amazing to get Brilliant. To this point. And yeah, it's super cool.
Congratulations on the book. Tell people where they can find it. I know it's on Amazon, so
yes, so I always love supporting small independent bookshops, and my publisher has an outpost in the UK. So you can, if you request it from an independent bookshop, they'll be able to get it in for you, but you can get it from the big players like Amazon as well. Yeah. And I think it could be a perfect present for yourself. If you've got a green thumb, then you'll end up having a brown thumb as well by the time you've read it, or for anyone else who's a gardener in your life. yeah, it's been a really great process writing it and seeing the feedback that I'm getting. So it's nice to be at this end of it.
Yeah, for sure. It looks like a very, because composting is relatively simple, but it's something that people really do struggle with, the ratios, and
Yes.
especially
Yeah.
here in Ireland, because we typically have a lot of green grass, and a lot of the
Yes.
time we don't have a huge amount to balance it with. So I think people struggle a little bit with the ratios and that sort of thing. So it looks
Yeah. Well,
like,
I've got a whole section on carbon to nitrogen ratios. But just on that, can I say to your listeners, so you're in autumn at the moment, or have you just entered winter?
we're in the winter now. Yeah.
You're in winter now. So I reckon, though, it's early winter, there probably still are beautiful fallen brown leaves on the ground. And I've got a whole chapter on how to use leaves in your regenerative garden, because they are so useful for so many different things, like leaf mold, or Korean natural farming leaf mold tea. You can use them as carbon in your compost as well. They're also really good just to leave on the soil, because lots of insects overwinter in them. But if you've got an excess of leaves that have fallen on a hard surface, rake them up and keep them throughout the year, because they're a free source of carbon that you can add with all of that really lush Irish grass that you're all growing all year round.
So it's been a really interesting chat. Compost is something that, well, look, we could talk about it for another 2 hours, but I'm quite conscious that you're sitting in your car, and I can see in the background it's after getting dark. So it's time to get inside at this stage, I think. It's been a really interesting chat. Congratulations on the book, and best of luck with it. I hope it goes really well over the next few months. Definitely looks like and sounds like a book that's really worth having for any home gardener. And Kate, thank you very, very much for coming on Master My Garden podcast.
My pleasure, John. Thank you for having me. And I feel like I'm not sure if I've said the name of my book, but it is called The Compost Coach.
Compost Coach.
So I hope I can coach your listeners into making kick-ass compost at their place.
Yeah, for sure. So, that's been this week's episode. Huge thanks to Kate for coming on. The Compost Coach is available through all your local bookshops or on Amazon. For anyone listening in Ireland, it's on amazon.co.uk. As I say, it sounds like and looks like a really practical guide to all the different types of composting. So when someone considers composting, we know the benefits of it. We maybe get bogged down a little bit on the ratios, and here in Ireland we struggle a bit with the too much greenery. And then we look at, we're looking at compost bins, are we looking at tumblers, are we looking at hot bins, are we looking at Bokashi? And I suppose the book will give you the ins and outs of all of those in a very, very simple and easy to follow format. So the Compost Coach available wherever you get your books, as I say, amazon.co.uk. And that's been this week's episode. Thanks for listening, and until the next time, happy gardening.